Welcome everyone. My name is Bron and I'd like to thank you all so much for being here. We're excited to have you join us today to talk about the importance of fostering an inclusive classroom through using the Universal Design Framework. Joining me this evening is our special guest Amanda from Illume Learning. Amanda brings a wealth of knowledge with 18 years experience in the education and disability sectors. An experienced classroom teacher whose passion for inclusive education was ignited by witnessing the outcomes for her students, Amanda has since worked in a number of education consultancy roles and authored educational resources, including Illume Reading and Enabled Learning, educating a student with Down syndrome. I'd like to hand over now to Amanda to talk about UDL. Welcome, Amanda.
So thank you very much to everybody for being here with me today for this session on Universal Design for Learning. So today we'll be talking about creating inclusive classrooms using the Universal Design for Learning framework. So in my role at Illume Learning, I work as the education consultant. So this is a space that's particularly exciting for me. Prior to working in a consultancy role, I worked in schools as a teacher for a number of years. And, I look back now and think that this is something that would have been, so exciting and so useful for me. But unfortunately, almost 20 years ago when I was in the classroom, this work wasn't really happening. So I'm really excited to be sharing this with you today. And without any further ado, we're going to dive straight in. So, what we're seeing across Australia and internationally is a real trend towards inclusion, meaning that more students with disabilities are being educated in general education classrooms. So, according to the NCCD, that data tells us that nearly 1 in 5, or almost 20%, of school students across Australia received an adjustment due to disability. So, we know that our classrooms are full of incredible diversity, many students who are learning in many different ways. And Universal Design for Learning is really about catering to the needs of all the learners within our classroom, not just those with a disability, but every student, which is why I think it's such an important framework. Now, many of you will be familiar with this bell curve. We know that our education system, for too long, I would say, has been designed around this idea of the bell curve. So, the bell curve basically tells us that if we teach to the middle, or to our average students, that we're going to reach somewhere between 68 and 95% of all students within our classroom. So most students. And for a long time, this has been considered acceptable practice, that those in the margins simply weren't being catered for. Nowadays, certainly in 2021, we know that we have an obligation and a requirement to do better. So there are policies and legislation right across Australia and globally that outline our responsibilities and the legal obligations that we have to teach and make sure that we reach all of the students within our classrooms. So, no longer can we be designing lessons to fit most of our students. We need to make sure that we are catering for all the students within our classroom in all that diversity. So, given that we know how much variance there is within our classrooms, how in fact do we teach and reach all of those students? And this is where this idea of universal design for learning comes in. So, the concept of universal design actually originates in architecture and construction. And it was all about alleviating physical barriers for individuals with disabilities. And while the concept, initiated in architecture and construction, it very quickly spread into the world of education. We know that what they found out very on when they were designing and constructing these buildings and spaces is that the supports that they were putting in place for people with a disability were actually having really far reaching benefits. What was necessary, for one, was proving beneficial for many others. So, an example of that, the installation of a ramp. So, you can see that picture on the screen there where they have installed a ramp in this public space. Now, initially, that consideration was made to accommodate for people who have mobility issues or a physical impairment, let's say someone who uses a wheelchair. But They also found that very quickly this ramp was beneficial for elderly who find stairs difficult to navigate, parents who were pushing prams, people who chose to ride their bike or their skateboard to work or to school. So, what was necessary for some individuals very quickly was beneficial to a whole range of others. Another example would be something like closed captioning on TV. So we know that that doesn't just serve those who are deaf or hard of hearing, that it also benefits people who are learning English, those who are working out at the gym, spouses who go to sleep at different times, young children who are learning to read. So what's necessary for some can be beneficial for all. If we look at this idea of universal design and making access equitable, we know that there are lots of different buildings in our country. This one, for example, on the screen is the State Library of New South Wales. These buildings were built quite a long time ago, before equitable access was a requirement and a consideration. And so many of these buildings and spaces are not accessible to almost a quarter of our population. So from this photo, you can see that when this building was built, it was not universally designed. So there are a large number of stairs you can see that you have to climb that are quite steep, no ramps, no handrails or anything to support you. So we can see that there are a number of people straight away who would have difficulty accessing that building. Absolutely. People who use a wheelchair, the elderly, individuals who have low vision and have difficulty navigating stairs, parents with prams. So straight away, we can see this building's not very accessible. But if we have a think about what would be required to make that building accessible, there are a number of options. The most obvious would be to build a ramp. But what we also see happening in instances like this one here is that people who can't access it traditionally using those front stairs have to use an alternative access point. So they're having to use a side door or a back door. And these kind of modifications that we have to make after the fact are an example of architectural retrofit. And here's another example of that here. So this is a school building that was built a very long time ago, mind you, obviously without equitable access being considered. So this school in recent years had a student who uses a wheelchair enroll to attend. And so to make this building accessible for that student, they've built this ramp. This is what we refer to as architectural retrofit, where the modifications to the building are an afterthought. Had this building been universally designed in the first place, this retrofit wouldn't have needed to happen. So there are a number of drawbacks to a retrofit approach. And I'm sure just by looking at that photo, some of them are probably quite obvious to you. We know for starters that oftentimes retrofits are more costly, even more so than if that building had been universally designed in the first place. Oftentimes they're very messy, very ugly, and I would argue that this is probably a good example of that. It's a beautiful old school building, and now the whole back of it is covered in this ramp. We often know that these retrofits are quickly put in place with one particular student in mind, or to try and solve one individual access problem rather than serving the needs of a diverse range of people. We often know as well that sometimes, they're not overly well designed. They have limitations and restrictions. So here you can see that this ramp, for starters, is very long, but also in part is quite steep. So would be quite difficult for a child who was, for example, in a manual wheelchair. So a number of drawbacks come when we try to retrofit or fix something after the fact. And this same idea applies to teaching and learning. We know that retrofitting our lessons is never going to be the best option for us. So instead, we need to make sure that we plan for all of our learners from the outset. So, Universal Design for Learning is a framework that was developed by an organization called CAST, C-A-S-T, the Center for Applied Science and Technology, that are based in the US. And if you're interested in learning and reading more about UDL, that's definitely one of the places that I would suggest. But to give you a bit of an overview of what UDL is, it's a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people. So, again, we're not just talking about a person or a student with a disability. A couple of really other important things that I want to talk to you about around this idea of UDL. The second one here is this idea of firm goals, flexible means. So, what I mean by that is that we are maintaining the rigor of our curriculum. So, if we have a student who is in grade 3, then they are working on that grade 3 curriculum. We are maintaining those grade 3 standards and goals and objectives, but we are being really flexible in the means to which they meet those goals, the means in which they demonstrate their understanding. So this idea of firm goals, flexible means is a really important one when we talk about UDL. It's also important to note that Universal Design for Learning is a framework. So it sits over the top of everything we do when we're planning, when we're teaching, when we're thinking about resources. Unfortunately for us, in a way, it's not a set of strategies. We can't just say, oh, yep, we can tick A, B, C. Great, we've done UDL now. So it's very much takes a shift in mindset and a change in thinking. And the really important thing about Universal Design for Learning is that we are planning for the margins from the outset. So we're considering all of the variability within our students, our classrooms, and planning for that from the outset rather than trying to retrofit and fix things along the way. I just wanted to talk really quickly about this idea of multi-tiered systems of support. So many of you will be familiar with this. So the UDL framework is something that we implement at Tier 1 across all students. It is a universal support. But we know that we may not reach every single student. So some will go on to receive more intensive Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports. There's often a lot of discussion around universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. Are they the same thing? Should we be doing one or the other or both? And it's important to know that UDL is not differentiated instruction. And I think one of the best explanations that I've come across for this is this video by a friend of ours by the name of Katie Novak. So I'm going to let you have a quick watch of that now.
People ask me all the time, what is UDL? UDL is Universal Design for Learning, and it is not a new name for differentiated instruction. There is a framework, Universal Design for Learning, and there is a framework, Differentiated Instruction. And although they can be used to complement each other, they are absolutely not the same thing. So let's talk about a little analogy that I like to use to explain the difference. Imagine for a moment that I was going to have a smashing dinner party. Now, if it was universally designed, I want to make sure that everybody is going to have an awesome meal at my party. And so I'm going to anticipate or predict the variability of possible guests. Now, as my best friends, you're all invited. And you're going to bring partners and friends, and I might not know exactly what they eat. But worry not. I can predict the variability. I'm going to predict that some people might be lactose intolerant, might be vegan or vegetarian, have cultural needs, or they might be picky eaters. And when I can predict this, I realize that it would be a really bad idea to serve a casserole, right? Because imagine you come into my party, you're thinking you're going to have an awesome time, boom, tuna noodle. Oh, I'm going to exclude a lot of people. But here's the thing. When I think universally, I recognize the importance of having different options and choices for everyone. And so when I universally design a party, I am going to serve a buffet. And the same thing happens in my classroom, is we can recognize and embrace the incredible variability of our students and identify the barriers that we know that some students face. And so if I recognize that I might have some students who struggle with language, some students who are decoding below grade level, some students who need additional challenges, I can create a buffet of ways for students to learn and share what they know using firm goals and flexible means. Now, differentiated instruction uses flexible groupings to make decisions about what specific students need. It's a great way to provide Tier 2 support or additional intervention for your students, but when you plan using differentiated instruction, it can feel a little bit like you are a short order cook. If you're coming to my party and I say, I'm gonna have to make something for the people who are lactose intolerant, and I have to have another dish for everyone who is vegan, and I wanna make sure I have something gluten-free, I am now a short order cook and my kitchen is on fire. And here's the thing, you don't get to make choices for yourself. So we want to universally design instruction, we want to be really proactive and planful about identifying barriers and making sure that we're not reacting and providing additional dishes for every student. So the next time you feel a little frazzled and on fire with planning because you're worried about every single group of students, take a step back, identify some barriers, and make a flexible buffet and allow learners to self-differentiate and self-direct their learning. Because at a buffet, when everyone makes their own plate and you provide feedback and support those choices, I'm telling you, it is a much better party.
So as Katie highlighted in that video, Universal Design for Learning is not differentiated instruction. We don't need to be choosing one or the other. So UDL is like having a dinner party with a buffet. So let's just imagine you've run a great maths lesson with your kids and now you want them to show you what they've learned. So to explain and justify how they solved a particular problem, for example. So you're going to tell them that they can do this in a number of different ways. They could write a poem, they could use some of these concrete manipulatives, they could draw a picture, they might like to pair up with a friend and act it out for you. They might choose another way to show you what it is they know. But you are giving them a buffet of options to choose from. They're going to select something that appeals to them and that plays to their strengths. With differentiated instruction, on the other hand, you're still providing options to students, but you are providing options that have been managed by the teacher. So if you know you have a student who has difficulty writing, you will ask them to draw their response instead. If you know you have a student who has a difficulty with oral presentations, then you might ask them to give you an essay response instead. So at the dinner party, this would equate to making separate meals for every single one of your guests. If you're a dinner party host, obviously you would choose to put on a buffet. And as teachers, we need to consider the same. So when we look at this UDL framework, as I mentioned before, it was initially designed by an organisation called CAST in the US. And the framework draws on two main areas of brain research. And this is the first up on the screen here. And this looks at learner variability. So what you can see here are fMRI images, so functional MRI images, of three different people. And these three individuals here were all completing the same task. It was a very basic finger tapping activity. But what you can see here is that each of those individuals are using completely different parts of their brain to complete that same task. In fact, we know that the way that we learn is as unique as our fingerprint. There would be no two people in the world that would have the same fMRI image. The second part of the research that I want to just mention really briefly is this idea of the three different networks of the brain. So studies have confirmed that when we are learning, there are three main networks that are active within our brain: the affective network, the recognition network, and the strategic network. So the affective network is responsible for the why of learning. So it really controls our emotional engagement with learning, such as our motivation, our interest, our ability to maintain focus and remain engaged in a task. The second area, our recognition network, that really controls the what of learning. So it's responsible for receiving that new information, processing that, and forming new concepts. And then finally, we have the strategic network, and that really governs the how of learning. So that network is responsible for planning, for executing, monitoring our actions. So they're the three different networks of the brain that are engaged and active during the process of learning. So when we then apply that to this whole idea of UDL, the basic premise is that to provide equitable opportunities for all the students in our class to enable them to reach those really high standards, we must provide multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So we are connecting into those three different networks of the brain. So when I talk about multiple means of engagement, that's really about tapping into our learners' interests. What interests them, what excites them, what engages them? How are we going to motivate them to be excited to learn? How are we going to challenge them? The second part here is about representation. So how we represent the information that we're going to be teaching. And this is really about giving our learners lots of different ways to learn or to acquire new information and skills. So representing that information in as many different ways as we possibly can. And then finally, action and expression. That really talks about encouraging students to use lots of different ways to demonstrate and to show us what they know. So we're going to dive into that in a little bit more depth here. But what I would like to show you really quickly are these UDL guidelines. So this is a website made available by CAST, and I've put the link on the bottom of the screen there. But it's a really nice, concrete way to have a look at these three networks and these three areas, because within these guidelines, they have expanded each of these core principles into a series of checkpoints that you can apply in your curriculum design, in your teaching. So a really nice, clear and concrete way of looking at those three networks. So I just wanted to share that resource with you. So let's now take this, make it a bit more practical again. So if we look at our teaching and our instruction in a classroom, we know that engagement is essential for learning. We also know that our students are going to differ in the ways in which they are engaged and motivated to learn, and also how they maintain and persist with their learning. So we need to be able to really recruit their interest and keep that sustained interest right the way through to the goal. So the kind of things that we can do to assist our students with this include things such as offering choice. Choice is a very big part of UDL. So choice of content, for example. So let's say we know that we're working on procedures today. So we need to be teaching that genre of procedure, but let's pick something to write about, a procedure that interests and engages the kids in our classroom, instead of how to make a piece of toast or how to tie your shoelaces. We also want to offer choice with the tools we use for learning. We want to make sure that we offer adjustable levels of challenge. So it's not reasonable to expect that every student in our class will be working at exactly the same level. So we have to be able to vary the challenge within our lessons. The key here is to really be mindful of what is the big idea. What is the outcome for this lesson? What do we want every single student to know? And once we as teachers are really clear of that big idea, we can tell our students that. We can look at different, adjustable levels of challenge to scale that up if needed or scale that down. So really making sure that all students are working towards that same big idea, regardless of ability. We also want to offer choices of learning context, so how their learning takes place. And that can be things like, are they going to stand up to do this activity? Are they going to sit down? Can we let them lay down? Can they sit on a wobble chair? What is the context? What is the environment going to look like for them in this instance? And a real key part of any kind of engagement is to make sure that learning is relatable to students and that they can link it to their real life experiences. So that's looking at engagement. Now we're going to have a look at representation, so that what of learning. So we know that all students require different ways to access the content. So as teachers, we have to provide multiple ways to represent that content. There is no one ideal way to teach something, because every student in our class will learn so differently. So some of the things that we can do We want to provide multiple examples. So we're teaching and reteaching in a variety of different contexts. So you might explain something to the class, you might draw it on the board, and then you might sit down and actually model that out with some concrete materials. You might play a little YouTube video that demonstrates that. There are so many different ways that we can impart that knowledge to our students. So it's about making sure that we are teaching in a variety of different ways. We also want to make sure that we highlight that big idea. So have it written up on the board, make sure it's prominent, keep coming back to that so students are really aware of what it is that they are learning. We want to try and break tasks down into component parts. So it might be too much to expect that a student will, sit down and write a procedure from A to Z in one go. But we might be able to get them to do one part today and another part tomorrow. So we're breaking down those component parts for them into chunks to enable them to be more successful. We want to provide multiple media and multiple formats. So, for example, when we're doing our face-to-face conferences, pardon me, we often we play a lot of videos. We use the PowerPoint functionality that enables captioning and text on the screen. Often we will talk about things, then we will get people to write down together. We'll get them to talk. I can guarantee you that every single one of you watching this right now will be doing something different. Some of you will be sitting back and just listening to me. Okay, some of you are probably off doing something in another corner of the room, listening but not watching. Others will just be reading everything that's written there on the screen and maybe not listening to too much of what I'm saying. Others will be writing lots of notes. We all learn in different ways. So we have to ensure that we enable that for our students as well. Finally, let's look more closely at the strategic network, so that how of learning. So we know that like all students learn differently, all students express their understanding differently. So we need to make sure that we have flexibility in our assessment tasks so that students, for example, with developmental language disorders, having them present their understanding through an oral presentation is not the best way to enable them to show you what they know. Likewise, for a student with a physical impairment, a written response might not be the best way to meet their individual needs and allow them to showcase their understanding. So we need to provide multiple options for our students to demonstrate and express what they've learned. So some things that we can be doing: providing flexible models of skilled performance. So show them what a completed task looks like. Show them, what is a model A if they're working towards getting an A? What would a C look like? What do we want their final product to be? We also need to make sure that we are giving them lots of opportunities to practice with support and with feedback, and that feedback is ongoing, that it's really relevant and appropriate to them. And this is where we start to teach self-reflection, self-assessment, peer feedback and peer assessment as well. So that's another really important component. Like I said, we have to offer flexible opportunities for being able to demonstrate that skill. So as an example, if you're assessing the narrative genre, it doesn't really matter if a child has a handwritten story neatly using pencil and paper in their book, or if they have typed that on a computer. What matters is that they have all of the structural components of that genre. So we need to make sure that we are being really flexible and really clear in what our goals are. What do we have to have them show us? But where have we got the flexibility, and where can we allow some movement and scope? We also want to make sure that we encourage frequent student responses. So we know that frequent output increases engagement. So always have them talking to you, feeding things back to you throughout the lesson, talking about new concepts along the way as you're learning them and practicing them, rather than just waiting for that one point in time assessment right at the end. So if we have a look at, again, universal design for learning in practice. So exactly, well, how do we do this within a classroom environment? It's a it's a big answer, but I'm going to break it down to its most simple simple core components here. The first thing that we need to do is identify the barriers. So remember that the barrier is not the child. So we're going to look at the task or the lesson and think, all right, what might some barriers be here for students? We've got to think about what will the barriers be to engaging them? What might the barriers be to how we plan to represent or deliver this content? Where might the barriers be in the assessment tasks? And if we can identify those barriers, then we can look towards some possible adjustments. So when we're looking at barriers, we need to look at the resources that we're using, our teaching practices, our planned assessments, and really look through all of that and work out, okay, well, where can I see there might be some difficulties here, and what adjustments can I put in place? So it is a really big topic. This is certainly just a little overview, but I'm really hoping that this is getting you thinking about your practice and how you can, I guess, be incorporating this into your classrooms, but also certainly into your schools as a wider framework. This is a topic that I often can spend days doing professional development with schools and teachers around, but I really hope that this has provided you with a bit of an overview. If you want to dive deeper into Universal Design for Learning, these are my favourite books on this topic. Paula Cluth's Universal Design Daily, 365 tips. So one thing that you can read each day and try and incorporate into your teaching and your pedagogy. And then the 3 books on the right-hand side there are all by Katie Novak, who is absolutely sensational. We're very excited to be running a UDL course with Katie in September of 2021. So I know you may all be watching this at different times, but certainly that's it's worth having a look into that if you're interested in finding out more. We also do a lot of professional development around this topic, in person and virtually. So certainly we would love the opportunity to be able to work with your school. But these books are a really great starting point, and you can purchase them at the link shown on the screen. Like I said, we're very excited about this short course that's coming up. The next one is September 2021, but we run them fairly regularly. So it's always worth jumping onto the Illume Learning website, heading to our events section and seeing, what exciting things we've got coming up. So just to summarize Universal Design for Learning, there's a couple of things to me that are the key takeaways here. So it's about having really high expectations for all of our students. So that idea of firm goals, but flexible means. It's about knowing our learners and responding to their needs from the outset. And something that, Katie Novak in particular talks about this a lot. She said there's always predictability in the variability. We know that there will always be students who are stronger readers than others. We know there will always be students who will have difficulty with, delivering presentations orally, for example. So there is always going to be a degree of predictability. We need to make sure that we are assigning our activities and gearing it to all the different learning styles within our class, our different interests that our students have, and their different levels of thinking. We need to make sure that we incorporate choice. So, like I said at the beginning, a really big part of Universal Design for Learning, choice about what our students learn, how they show us what they know. So that, over time, when you teach them how to make these choices, they become, really, independent learners, expert learners, and are able to make really informed, quite incredible choices about how and what they learn. And then finally, my big takeaway here from UDL is it is about all students. So it is inclusive of all. And that idea of what is essential for some can benefit all is a really, really important message to take away. So just finally, we would love to connect with you. Like I said, here at Illume Learning, we work with schools right across Australia in consultancy roles through delivery of professional development. So we would absolutely love the opportunity to connect with you. You'll find us at our website there. I've put my email address up. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. So we'd love to hear from you. We have lots and lots of exciting events coming up first place to hear about those is always on our Facebook or Instagram. So we'd love to see you on our social media pages as well. But again, I would just like to say a very big thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you for your commitment to improving education for students with disabilities. And I really hope to work with you again soon.
Thank you so much again, Amanda, for joining us. We hope that you all enjoyed the webinar and learned something new. Don't forget to visit the Illume Learning website to find out more about UDL, and we have sent the link in the chat. This webinar has been recorded, so if you would like to share it with a colleague or re-watch something, stay tuned and it should hit your inbox later tonight. We will also be sending out certificates to everyone via email. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time.